which most Jews understood, but his own soldiers would not. Hopefully, then, they would not discover what a weak word warrior he was. But Eleazar, of course, would carefully frame his declarations in Latin to make very sure they would understand. "Hail, Eleazar ben Yair! What would you have of me this morning? Have you at last come to your senses about the matter of surrender?" There was, as Silva had expected, only laughter from the heights. Then he heard Eleazar's voice, like his own, unstrained and yet easily heard. "Last night my usually peaceful slumbers were uneasy because my belly was overfull. I became worried about poor Flavius Silva and his miserable soldiers scratching in the dust of our desert. And a great sense of pity overwhelmed me because I envisioned you down there when the true heat of the summer arrives. All night I could think of nothing save how your eyes will fry and how innumerable insects will feast upon your heat sores and open wounds. How goes the dysentery? Do you wonder if you still have intestines? Let me remind you how the coming heat will set your bowels on fire. Have you all carefully examined your skin lately? Do so, I beg you. For it should be coming now, with the heat, the curse of our land, which you will have if you remain in Judea. Leprosy. Even the wind carries it to the valleys of our desert. Look now at your hands and limbs. The smallest lesions is the first sign. If you are alert and go at once to cooler air, then you may be cured. Otherwise, you will wear the bell for the rest of your days." Pomponius Falco and his company had caught up at last. Behind him, Silva heard them exclaiming over the ease with which they could hear the Jew on Masada. "They cluck like women spectators discussing a chariot race," he thought with disgust, but he was determined Falco should understand why he consented to such parleys. "He calls down a challenge every few days. He asks for me my name, and if I send a subordinate, then he proclaims I am afraid to face his message. He knows very well we must be out by summer or go mad. Hence he repeatedly reminds us of passing time, which makes the heat worse. He has my troops feeling half sick, whether they are not. They spend all their spare time pawing themselves looking for diseases they never heard of, and at the slightest sign of a pimple, off they run for the surgeons. By repetition, by constantly striking the heat theme, he intends to make his threats a fact, and it is now very possible he may succeed." Pomponius Falco waved his hand limply at the flies about his face. "How long must you listen to this vermin-infected orator? Would you have me retreat before his words? I do not like fighting battles with my tongue, but until the ramp is finished I have no other choice." Silva turned his back on Falco and addressed himself once more to the diminutive figure on top of Masada. "Listen to me, Jew, more carefully than you have in the past, when there might have been some petty reason to build false hope in your people. I command you, bring them all to the ramparts now, all of your men, women, children. Let them see how close the ramp approaches and judge for themselves how long it will be before my legionaries soak their blades in your blood. Then will your people know how you have given them the cruelest of lies, how you have held up false words as shields against the might of your benefactors. They will call you Eleazar the Deceiver for generations, each one telling the next how you were the only cause of their calamity. Surrender now, while there is still time. In the name of Vespasian, I command you to give up your arms and descend. I promise the milk of your mothers will flow again. While Silva held out his right hand to finalize his vow, he glanced over his shoulder at Falco. Listen now how he will pound away on the same old subject. Silva was almost pleased when Eleazar's voice came down to them. The tonality unchanged, the same easy and relaxed cadence of words, the suggestion of the benign uncle advising a difficult nephew. Perhaps now even Falco could understand that Eleazar ben Yair was no ordinary antagonist. My people are on the walls now, looking down upon your wretched little soldiers in their fancy dress. Oh, Flavius Silva, poor little general! Are you by chance pleading with the true proprietors of this land to spare you at least another 1,000 deaths from the coming heat of summer? Beware of it. There is still time for you to strike your tents and go down to the sea where the air is fresh and cool, where our loathsome diseases will not chew on your bones. Go down to the cool sea to satisfy your lust, where there is wine and all variety of food. Leave us our parched desert and nothing more. Go down while there is still time. We will send down food and cool water for your journey. While the voice droned on, repeating passages in Latin that were first spoken in Greek so that all would understand, Falco moved to Silva's side. This is disgraceful, he hissed. How can you tolerate such humiliation? As long as he makes you listen, he is insulting Rome. If I refuse to hear him, you may be sure my troops will listen all the more attentively. My provident arrival makes the solution quite simple. You have merely to inform the ruffian that I have arrived hearing an order from Vespasian. The emperor has ordained that if they surrender immediately, they will be granted complete amnesty. Is that true? For a moment, Silva found himself hoping. Of course not. Once they have given up their arms, you have simply to crucify every one of them, and the matter is done with. Silva looked into Falco's eyes, and for the first time noticed how he had outlined them with some sort of cosmetic. Now he saw that his lips were strangely colored with purple, and he thought, since all else is a lie about this man, how can I trust him out of my sight? Yet I most certainly cannot share a tent with him. Falco, I have underestimated you, he said slowly. They should send more such clever representatives from Rome, and perhaps my many other problems might be solved. Would you prefer to make the offer yourself? I will consent to do it, so if you will understand that I am not here to demean you, but to help. Silva thought, I'm being forced by circumstance to give up the grape. Otherwise, how can I keep up with this chameleon? He pinched at the ache between his eyes and said, perhaps it will be more impressive if you go up the ramp some distance so that you are separated from the rest of us and appear to function as a new authority. The distance between us and your lack of armor will make your offer more credible. He saw hesitation in Falco's eyes, but before he could find objection, he called out to the ramparts. The gods have been kind to you, Eleazar. 2 great Romans have arrived with the dawn. They are Pomponius Falco, the emperor's deputy, and his aide, Cornelius Tertullus. Vespasian has taken a fatherly interest in your faith. If these men come forward to give you a message, will you guarantee their safety?" There was a moment's silence on the mountaintop. Then Eleazar's voice came without change. "Let them come as far as they wish. They will not be harmed." For a moment, Silva thought Falco was about to balk, but then he saw his expression settle into such a serious mien he hardly seemed of the same face. He straightened his blouse and touched at his hair, yet somehow the gestures were not particularly feminine. And when he beckoned to Cornelius, he seemed to have passed his transformation onto the boy. Both of them started up the ramp as if they were on parade. They halted erect and proud, some 30 paces up the ramp. Silva found himself entertaining an insult of regret for what he was certain would happen. Then he smiled at his own weakness. Regret for a man you despise? Better spend these precious moments making your own preparations. Keeping his voice just above a whisper, he ordered the archers to fall back and the standard-bearers to accompany them. To Attius and Gallus he said, "Let us count to 20 and then stroll slowly for that large rock over there." As Falco's high voice rang out, Attius and Gallus solemnly nodded their understanding. "Jews of Masada, hear the word of Vespasian." Falco paused dramatically. There was no sound in the desert except the harsh plaint of the soaring crows. "If you will abandon Masada at once and pledge all of your people to our useful purpose, then all of you will be granted complete amnesty. All of your past crimes will be forgiven. So what have you to fight and die for now? Ask, Eleazar. Ask the men who are your leaders. I await your answer." "He does have style," Silva admitted to himself as he moved toward the large rock. And he was fearless in his way. There he stood quite alone except for the frail boy beside him, chin high, feet spread wide apart, arms folded, as if waiting in judgment on the very mountain itself. Once behind the rock, Silva peered up at the ramparts. Then he said quietly to Attius and Gallus, "Here comes their answer, as foreseen." They watched a small shape arc over the ramparts and appeared to hang for an instant against the morning sky. It enlarged and, while descending almost straight down, fragmented into a collection of odd-shaped objects. Then it rained down upon Pomponius Falco and Cornelius Tertullus until they were deluged in garbage. Offal and animal bladders filled with the human urine and excrement. Such was the force and volume of the collection, they were knocked off their feet. They picked themselves up, crying out their dismay, screaming as they discovered each new filth, ran blindly down the ramp. Silva kept his voice perfectly flat when he turned to Attius and Gallus. He shook his head. "Pity about this sort of thing. Very bad for Roman status."
Chapter 2 of the Besieged. Like some exhalation of a body in death, the laughter terminated, and a dreadful silence again ruled the top of Masada. Eleazar ben Yair was beginning to find the silence that fell upon his people something he could hear. It was as if he stood among a sea of ears, all poised, all turning slowly around and around, seeking to detect the slightest interruption in the conspiracy of listening. And as the ramp climbed even higher, he noticed how the silences were becoming more prolonged, and even when they were finally broken by some individual who refused to mute his voice, the melancholy lingered for increasingly longer spans of time. My people, Eleazar thought, are as wavelets in the wind. They respond to every influence, however slight, and the effect remains long after the force has passed. I must comfort myself in believing that, like the sea, they show a different face to the sun than lies beneath.
Eleazar ben Yair preferred to consider his major perplexities in nautical terms, for prior to the Great War, a time he often thought of as another life enjoyed by another man. He had been a native of Bethsaida, a town known as the House of Fishes, on the western shore of the Lake of Galilee.
There he had been a fisherman of more than ordinary repute. Yet he took delight in warning others that if all the lies concerning the size of his catch could be believed, then he must certainly be the greatest fisherman since the Exodus from Egypt, which would now be 1,065 years, and maybe even longer. He would add, with his inviting smile, "You understand, of course, that all Galileans are fighters from the cradle, and this peculiar endowment applies to the fish as well as to those of us who dwell on dry land. It is for this simple reason that only a Galilean can catch Galilean fish. All others need not trouble themselves." Eleazar's Hebrew, with its slurred gutturals, more closely resembled Syrian, but there were few on Masada who found it offensive. Even the Judeans, who were so inclined to snobbishness about the purity of their words, easily forgave Eleazar his dictional transgressions, and after moments, if they heeded him well, became lost in his message. There were many reasons for the almost immediate creation of this spell, whether Eleazar spoke to a multitude or simply to an individual. He was in the first place blessed with a splendid physique, being taller than most men by a palm or even two, and yet of heft and proportion to match. Like so many Galileans, he was of fair complexion, and his eyes were blue-green, as if forever stained with the colors of his sea. His strength was not unusual among the fishermen of Galilee or any other waters, and his great-fingered hands might be equally exchanged with any true mariner. Some said it was his movement that were responsible for the impression that he was a man of extraordinary beauty, although even those most under his influence knew he was not. All were agreed there was something different about his use of body and limb, for even a turn or step became a maneuver of leopard grace. He knew how to put the total of his force into a pull or a push. He knew how to gesture with his big hands so they seemed to encompass the world, and he knew instinctively how best to make his stand, whether opposed by word or weapon. Even his most faithful followers admitted that his air of controlled majesty had much to do with his sometimes being called a demagogue, but they would recommend his critics ask Eleazar ben Yair himself how it was that he came to be the chosen leader of the people on Masada. Then he would tell them the truth. None of these people trust each other. We Galileans are chronic rebels against the Romans, yet I am a zealot because there is nothing else in Palestine left to be. I am neither a Sicarius or a Pharisee, nor a Sadducee, nor an Essene, or even a man of strict devotion to God. I sometimes even doubt the very existence of God. He seems careless and permits me to live very temporarily while others die all around me, so I can only suppose he wants it that way. I have, with my own hand, killed more Jews than most Romans, because they refuse to fight. I am a fighter, and the others know it, and that is why I am their leader. The face of Eleazar ben Yair contributed greatly to the spell which seemed to emanate from him even when he was most at ease. In the manner of his people he was unshaven, but he kept his beard well trimmed. His skin had been so tormented by wind and sun that at times it appeared metallic in texture, and it seemed that if a sword struck his cheek, it would only blunt its edge. Yet, as if to reaffirm his equality with more vulnerable men, his nose had been so badly broken, it seemed to spread half across his face, and his teeth were also broken and irregular.
For so young a man, his eyebrows were very heavy, a feature which sometimes lent him the look of a bleached Satan, and which, with full realization of the effect, he would sometimes mischievously employ to relieve the tension on Masada. His voice was normally soft, as is so often the case with men of the sea, although when addressing his zealots it took on a special resonance, as if to capture the ear of the most indifferent listener.
Took on a special resonance, as if to capture the ear of the most indifferent listener. The people of Masada found it nearly impossible to long ignore Eleazar ben Yair, whether he kept his peace or not. They were influenced by his very history, knowing that he was the last survivor of a family of fighters and martyrs. His father, who was called Josiah, having been slain by the Romans, and his grandfather, who was called Josiah, having been killed by Herod. And during the siege of Jerusalem, where Eleazar himself had fought under Simon Bar Giora, 3 of his brothers had been crucified by the Romans. Though he was careful not to seem overly influenced by the savage Sicarii, he had adopted much of their thinking, and over the door of his quarters he had fixed a Sicarius banner with its defiant wording, "God alone is the Lord. Death does not matter. Freedom is all." Secretly, Eleazar cursed all the sects of Palestine. What had they brought to the Jews but division and hatred, and now chaos and agony? There were clusters of every sect on Masada, and there were many times when he despaired of uniting them. "Listen, my dear friends," he had so often admonished them. "I am nothing. I am only a sandstone in God's eye. I do not care how you worship God, and I beg you now, in our time of peril, not to care how others do. I do not care if you live by the written or oral law, or know both by heart. Be like me, or we must all die, or of our own quarreling. Be like me, a Jew, and only a Jew." All of this contributed to his spell. There was also the attribute of Eleazar's education, which he had obtained in his naturally zestful manner. As in most of Palestine before the war, excellent schooling was available to any youth at a price, so Eleazar satisfied his yearning by saving a fish from each cast. The fish went to his teacher, and yet even when the catch had been so light, it might better have gone to his stomach, he said. "My belly can shrink and expand with my luck, but my brain cannot be preserved like a dried fig." Therefore, Eleazar ben Yair was not only renowned as a fisherman, but before he was 22, he was known as a literator, which implied that he had a smattering of letters, and all of this was also before the war. Eleazar had brought Miriam, his wife, with him to Masada, and she was also of a fishing family, although there was no similar record of rebellion in her blood. Though the Zealots had originated in Galilee, she had never heard of them until after her marriage, and then told of their intentions, how they would drive the Romans out of Palestine. She simply said it sounded foolish and unrealistic. Miriam was, in the style of her people, a woman of considerable strength and large of bone and feature, which embarrassed her. Rather would she have been dainty and even fragile in appearance, and it was true that whenever she was in proximity with such a woman, she became unaccountably shy and meek, as if by assuming such a pose she might make it an actuality. She was fair, even for a Galilean, and her hair, so neatly braided, caused much comment,
because it was the color of sand.
It had been 10 years since Miriam had worn the veil over her eyes and crowned it with a wreath of myrtle, and been given in marriage to Eleazar ben Yair, the fisherman. Since those days of rejoicing she had known only total devotion to her husband, and he to her, the same whether they fought the Romans or other Jews for survival, or lived in peace, a condition they had nearly forgotten. While her husband often expressed his doubts, Miriam would allow no influence to cloud her traditional relation with God. It was she who had frowned at the Sicarius banner over the door and quietly fixed a mezuzah below it.
And she had made sure it contained the longitudinally folded squares of parchment with the 2 passages from Deuteronomy written on 22 lines. Miriam was always deeply pleased when visitors touched the shining metal case and then kissed their fingers.
Eleazar had this to say of his marriage: "My Miriam was created just as were all other women, not from man's eye, which would have made her envious in nature, nor from his ear, which would have made her a gossip, nor from his mouth, which might have made her a magpie. God created her from man's rib, and I searched everywhere for the one missing from my own cage until I found Miriam. At times, when he chose to tease her, he would say,
'Then who should be surprised that a man who is made of soft stuff is the more agreeable, while a woman made of bone is naturally so much harder?'"
Standing on the outermost rampart, Eleazar ben Yair, the son of a rebel and the grandson of a rebel, surveyed his domain with the reborn hope of every new day. He squinted at the sun and whispered a prayer that it would become an intolerable torch by midday. The sun was hope. Hurling refuse at the Romans, he thought, was only a secret signal of despair. He looked down upon the great desert which stretched to all the horizons. There, beyond the plateaus to the south, was the valley of Sodom and Gomorrah, which he had first considered as an area of refuge, but finally decided against. Long ago it had been a rich land, but now it was all wasted and burned. Those who believed in such things explained how the wickedness of the inhabitants had sucked a divine fire from the sky, and even to this day fruit plucked from the few remaining trees dissolved into smoke and ashes. At least, Eleazar thought, here on Masada we are victualled for many more years. The last of our fat-tailed sheep was slaughtered only yesterday, and we have only his left horn to serve as a trumpet and a memory. But we have oil and grain and dates and wine in abundance. And we have also weapons for men 10 times our number, and water sufficient even for the joy of bathing. What other besieged have ever known such luxuries? He looked down upon the wilderness surrounding Masada and saw the long line of bearers bringing supplies to the Romans from the north. They were always there, night and day, and how well he knew the route. He had come the same way from Jerusalem with 1,000 men, women, and children, dragging themselves across the labyrinths of ravines, crumbled rocks, flint-hard earth, and everlasting thorns, sand, and swirling dust. There was delirium, O leader of innocence and pure madness, to suppose the Romans would not pursue, yet for some strange reason they had not followed, and certainly that had been a miracle. So why was it unreasonable to expect another? Think, Eleazar Ben-Yair, think how it is already the 3rd and 20th day of Adar, and how next month will assuredly bring the heat pounding mercilessly upon the heads of the Romans, and how they will never withstand the hell of summer. Save thy breath. Let the sun scream at them. They will dissolve in their own sweat.
He felt the feathered touch of a small moist hand against his own, and looked down upon his son Reuben. Well now, little one, what are thy plans for this day? A run along the beach, perhaps? A stop to investigate a tiny crab? Or will you capsize a shell and, after examining the marvelous pattern of its swirls, be forced to make the great decision? Will you take it home to thy mother or throw it back into the sea? Whatever you decide, remember that next year I will expect you to start helping me about the boat, and I will begin to teach you how a mullet must be caught, and show you the very best place to net fingerlings. And then the following year, Eleazar
looked away to the east and north, where he could observe a portion of Lake Asphaltitis, which some called the Dead Sea. It was already shimmering in the heat, and he thought how strange it was that even such a lifeless patch of water could bring him visions of living things. For from the same water came the bitumen with which he had once caulked his boat. He looked down again and at his son, and wondered if Reuben would ever leave this desert tomb and sail upon the sea. How so very small he was, and still so fragile. Nor does he understand how any other human being can bear him the slightest malice. All that he has seen here is meaningless to him. He thinks the Romans build the ramp so they may come for a visit. Lord God, if you exist for all Jews, then spare him. Show me the miracle that will spare him. His face is dirty, he said softly to Miriam. I know, she said. He fell running to hear his father frighten the Romans. You had him feeling very sorry for them. She was silent for a moment, then looked down upon the ramp. The legionaries were rounding up their charges and driving them back to work. How much longer? She asked. 30 days at the most. And then? There are many who believe we should surrender now. Not so many. There are a few worms in every keel. Her eyes told him that she was afraid, and he knew she was not afraid for herself, but for Reuben. He wondered if all husbands and wives could communicate with such silent ease. He picked up the boy and held him high against the sun. And while Reuben shouted his delight, he said to her, How could so happy a boy have such a gloom for a mother. Once, she said mischievously, you called me your tower of joy. Laughing, he set the boy down. Take warning, son. Though you may learn to weave a net which will hold almost anything, you will never equal the mesh of a woman's memory. Holding hands with the boy between them, they descended from the ramparts. At the side of the western palace, which had been Herod's principal residence, Eleazar left them and walked around the building toward the north. It was the route he followed every morning, the closing of his post-dawn tour, which normally commenced at the Serpent Path Gate on the eastern side of Masada, and then continued southward along the casements where many people had made homes between the walls. Along the way, he would question the lookouts at every station, of which there were 30 and 2 between the gate and the southern tip of Masada, and he would greet those people and their children who had come with him out of Jerusalem and across the wilderness. And he knew most of them by now, so that he could call them by name, and he knew many of their children down to the several born on Masada. It was important, Eleazar reasoned, for him to listen at least shortly to every lament and complaint, of which there were invariably a great number, because if he did not, there were only the priests to give counsel, and he mistrusted them mightily. Even in his extremity, 1/10 of the jars of food, wine, and oil were marked for their consumption, and every family gave challah from their daily batch of dough. Yet the priests contributed so very little. They were too busy reading the Word of God to prepare their own food, and too busy arguing in the mikveh about the scheme of yet another ritual bath to work on the walls. They were so preoccupied praising God for things he had done long ago, they could not beseech him for help at what must be done now. Nor could their overburdened attentions be held long enough to make of them good lookouts, and not one of them had the slightest skill at arms. In a moment of anger, he had once said to them, I am God's whip here now. I can help you if you will heed me. I cannot if we spend our time arguing about dimensions of temples. He had been somewhat shocked at his own words until later, when he had time to think about it. In a sense, it was true. He was daily obliged to play God, and when he failed to behave accordingly, those who accused him of despotism were the first to whirl around and call him lax in his duty. Though objections of his policies were never-ending, and he had offered to step down many times, no other man on Masada disputed his leadership. Very well then, let the objections continue if they provided relief for frightened tongues and meant no more. And let the praying and scripture reading prevail if it would keep terror from their minds. Now in moments of desperation or even exasperation, he found himself repeating to them, Give me your strength as you would to God, each one of you, or you will certainly perish on this rock. Here now, he thought, was pure blasphemy. If anyone dared accuse him, let them. He would remind his accusers of the greatest general the Romans had on their side at Jerusalem, and he was God himself who allowed the Jews to fight among themselves. During his tour, he would descend to the cistern at the southern end of Masada, and there solemnly examine the water level. It was a ceremony intended to impress all who watched, and he was careful to conceal his true reactions. Actually, there was water enough for 1,000 more people on Masada, and it was merely the sight of it dropping over so slowly in volume that cheered him. Like our food, he mused, water was one of the very few things the god of Masada had no cause to worry about. On the southern limits of the ramparts, he would pause and study the Roman camp which stood across the chasm. It was a small camp compared to the others, and he was certain it could be overwhelmed by a determined band of men. It would be possible for such a group to descend into the chasm from this tip of Masada and then make their way up the opposite side to the camp. And then what? Aye, there was the hole in the sail. Even if it were physically possible to lower the balance of the people on Masada to the bottom of the chasm and then hoist them up to the conquered camp and a possible escape route, the endeavor would take too long. Once daylight had come, the Romans would be more than poised for a massacre. In spite of his convictions, Eleazar ben Yair had never been able to leave the southern citadel without again trying to envision a new route of escape. He knew that he must not permit even a moment of hopelessness to enter his mind. And lately, as the ramp mounted closer to the western gate, he noticed how many more impossible schemes he devised to cover his growing despair. From the southernmost citadel, Eleazar's inspection route took him along the western wall to the old palace in which 300 men, women, and children now lived. They were cramped, but each family occupied one corner of a room, and most had managed to construct some kind of privacy. The beehive of activity about Herod's buildings amused Eleazar. How the old villain would rave if he could watch his present guest. He would hardly approve of their scrawling on the frescoes, or their mud stoves on the tiles, or their defecating on his terraces. What kind of god spared such people?
These survivors of Jerusalem were mostly the ignobles, the connivers, and the cunning who had determined from the very beginning to let the other man be the hero. Except for a minority of dedicated zealots, these were the people who had cowered in the ruins of Jerusalem, never to be seen during the fighting, and cunning enough to eat during the famine. They had shifted from side to side, from Simon to John, before the burning of the temple, being one day a zealot and the next a conservative. Whatever seemed most likely to endure. Many would have become Romans had the chance been offered them.
Many would have become Romans had the chance been offered them. You are like so many grains of sand, he had told them when they had at last arrived safely at Masada. To survive this time, you must become mortar. Now, as on every morning after his inspections, Eleazar walked to the building that had once housed Herod's officials and administrators. There would be gathered his own leaders and advisors for the daily council of war. They would review the latest accounts of stores and adjust the rationing accordingly.
Disputes between sects or even individual families would be exposed and usually solved to no one's complete satisfaction. Plans were laid for new eventualities created by the Romans, and the progress of the ramp discussed endlessly.
If there were any new reports from outside Masada, be they rumor or otherwise, they would be heard, and if the wine tithe for the priest had turned out to be sour, then that was heard. Eleazar had noticed that as the ramp approached nearer, there was less and less discussion of resistance strategy. Instead, the ramp and all it portended slipped behind the shadow of domestic problems which seemed to multiply with the general tension. Judas, son of Myrto, was tormenting his wife again, and her screams were keeping everyone who lived in the east wall awake. Jacob, son of Balgas, and his whole family were sick with some mysterious ailment, and would it not be wise to forbid them contact with all the others? The daughter of Ardalas, son of Matthias, had been raped by Shimeon, son of Ezra, according to her family,